Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Cox, the CEO of the Invasive Species Council, and welcome to this 10th Aliens Among Us Q&A webinar. 10 episodes is a great milestone. We've been running for a couple of years now, and yeah, it's good to see the growing interest in our Aliens Among Us webinar. First of all, I want to acknowledge the country that we're all listening from. I'm on Gundungurra and Darug lands, and I want to honour and pay respect for the elders of those lands and the great management that they have conducted for their land. And I also want to give a special welcome to any First Nations people on this webinar today. So this is an Aliens Among Us. This is an interactive session. We're recording today's session so you can listen to it later on for your friends and others on our website. Today, we've got a special guest. It's Dr. Jenny Newell. She's the author of a book, Trading Nature, Tahitians, Europeans, and Ecological Exchange. Here's the book. It didn't work very well. I'll do that later on. And Jenny is a curator of climate change at the Australian Museum's Climate Solutions Centre. Welcome, Jenny.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation to come today.
Thanks. You'll see Jenny in a second. Also joining us is a panel of three. We've got Christine Milne, who's our ambassador, former leader of the Federal Greens, and she's coming to us from Tasmania. Welcome, Christine.
Thanks, Andrew. Great to be here.
Thank you, Christine. And we've got Richard Swain, our Indigenous ambassador. He's calling to you from southern New South Wales. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Andrew. Hello, everyone.
And then finally in our panel is Tim Lowe, our co-founder. He's an author, co-founder of the Invasive Species Council through the book Feral Future. And Tim, welcome. I want to especially congratulate you on your recent awarding of a Member of the Order of Australia. So well done, Tim.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Yes, that great card, that monster card.
Good. All right, let's get underway. I'll come back to Jenny. Because this is an interactive session. The way you ask questions is you enter them in the Q&A down the bottom, not the chat, but the Q&A. So as we go, we'll pick up questions. And what we want to do is explore Jenny's amazing book, Trading Nature, which is all about ecological exchange between the Europeans and the Tahitians. So let's get underway, Jenny. So I want to set the scene a little bit because this whole everything that flows on from ecological exchanges in Tahiti really starts in 1767. On 19th of June, Captain Samuel Wallis on the HMS Dolphin, suffering from malnutrition and scurvy, arrived in Matavia, Tahiti. He left behind a British flag and gifted local chief Puria 3 guinea hens, a pair of turkeys, a pregnant cat, and a garden planted with peas. And of course, there was the stowaway black shipwrecks that also came to shore. And so began an exchange between Europeans and Tahitians that would change their ecological trajectories. So Jenny, your book explores that rich story of how plants and animals are understood and traded by Europeans and Tahitians. And it also gives an interesting insight into why the ecological exchange occurred. So tell me, what prompted your interest in Tahiti and this question of ecological exchange?
Thanks, Andrew. And I also want to acknowledge the Gadigal people on whose land the Australian Museum rests, land that's never been ceded. So it was a fun journey to get to the eventual book. I'd had a long-term interest, always have, in relationships between people and other species, and particularly in cross-cultural contexts over time. And I guess I was studying history at the ANU and had a real focus on environmental history. And after my degree, I was a research assistant in the Centre for Cross-Cultural Research at the ANU. And I was immersing myself in all these voyaging journals from the 18th century. And as part of that research, I was up at the State Library and the Mitchell Library there looking through manuscripts, and I came across this incredible unpublished manuscript by George Tobin, who was a lieutenant on Bligh's second breadfruit voyage, the Providence. And it was amazing. So it had all these incredible descriptions of his time on shore, for quite a long time on shore, talking to the Tahitians, figuring out, learning their language. He just loved spending time learning all about Tahiti, and he was tracking all these different interactions and flows of species between the two groups. And he was doing watercolors of their times together, and it was just the most incredible source. And I could see that, because no one had really studied this one before, it would be an amazing opportunity to just delve into this and start a PhD project, and really I was hooked. And so it was then a process of discovering all the other accompanying capturing of encounters and exchanges, and all the things that the ship's captains were bringing out from England and France and Spain, and incredible numbers of animals being brought on these small ships in these really difficult conditions. And I was just trying to understand what was going on for them in terms of motivations, and then seeing how much the Tahitians were managing those exchanges once those species arrived, and once the trades were trying to be established, and how just really interested in those nexuses between the different plays of power and different impacts of the different ecologies coming together.
I might, Jenny, share just a couple of paintings from that period, because they really capture some of the atmosphere. I'll just do that now. Let's just share these paintings. It must have been an amazing experience for the Tahitians to really make that first contact with Europeans. Do you want to just talk about this image and maybe what's going on through the minds of the Tahitians?
Sure, we can only guess, but this is an image from a little bit after the Wallace encounter, which was the first one. This is Cook's second voyage, and this is a painting by Hodges. You can see it's a fairly relaxed scene, and I think it's because there was always quite an easy relationship that had been established after the first encounters, which had not been easy and had ended up in violence with the Wallace encounter. But by this stage, there was a lot of eagerness to just sort of trade the pigs and the chickens and the coconuts and the breadfruit from the island out to the ships, and they're getting a lot of great things back from those ships. And so it was really quite a useful and lucrative trade for the Tahitians. When Europeans first arrived, it had been quite confronting, because there'd been a prophecy about a while before saying that there was going to be people arriving with a different skin, with canoes without an outrigger, and that they would bring huge change. And so there was a lot of nervousness within the Society Islands about those new people who were coming, and they had good reason to be worried, because there certainly was just huge rafts of change that then just swept through the islands in the hundreds of years to follow.
Well, I might just share the other two pictures just quickly, and then we can come back to maybe those first interactions. So this second one.
So this is one of the paintings by George Tobin. So he was really quite a good watercolorist. He was an amateur, but he was also an amateur naturalist. But you can see he's paying attention to the different types of plants. You've got the breadfruit on the left there, that big tree, and then there's lots of coconut palms and the smaller shrubs and so on that he was capturing there. And he's showing the provisioning of the ships with the watering here. So he's got the fresh water being collected in barrels, and they're being taken out on the small boat out to the Providence, which is out of shot. out of view, but you can also see some of the Tahitians' canoes there, and fishing going on, and other just sort of everyday activities, but he was really capturing lots of those everyday events, which a lot of other artists didn't capture because they were just trying to capture Tahiti as a more of an untouched kind of place. So yeah, it was an interesting set of views that he was able to give us.
Yeah, good. I just making sure I got the right screen. Yes, and this third one. Sorry, how about this one?
This next one is by Thomas Ghost, and it's when it comes up, you'll see it's a capturing a sort of a fairly formal view of the breadfruit exchanges that occurred from 1792 with actually a bit earlier as well. But so yeah, Captain Bligh was out in Tahiti to collect up breadfruit plants to take to the Caribbean in order to provide a really good, wholesome and sturdy and reliable food source for the slaves there. They'd been having lots of famines because they'd chopped down all the forests and rains were stopping, and so it was really difficult. They needed to bring in something which was sturdier, and they knew that the Tahitian breadfruit was a good source. So the image isn't coming up though, is that right? It's not.
Yeah, that's okay.
It's on the cover anyway. If you want to.
Let's just explore that a bit more detail in a minute. I'm going to bring in Tim Lowe now. Tim, you've written about the impact of invasive species in Australia, and particularly that bestseller Feral Future that led to the formation of the Invasive Species Council. Tim, how does Australia fit into the Tahiti story?
Well, we had the infamous acclimatisation movement involved in introduction of starlings, sparrows, hares, and all sorts of unwise plants. And it was really foreshadowed by what the explorers were doing. And so Bligh, on the way to Tahiti, he stops on Bruny Island, Tasmania, and he plants a garden. Apple trees, pears, oranges, lemons, peaches, plums, cherries, bananas, grapes. It's extraordinary just planting them in just this wild setting and then sailing on to Tahiti. And this was, in fact, a normal thing for explorers to do. And it really makes you wonder in that obviously the movement of plants is a sensible thing up to a point, but it was kind of a bit over the top what the explorers were doing. I mean, Ernest Giles, a later explorer in Central Australia, was planting blue gums and wattles in around an oasis north of Ayers Rock. And so, yeah, this really strange obsession with kind of civilizing landscapes with edible plants. And so yeah, Bligh is famous for the breadfruit story, but he was actually transferring more plants than just breadfruit, or trying to. I mean, none of his Tasmanian plants survived.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. I might bring Christine Milne in here now. Christine, with your Tasmanian connections, your knowledge of what's been happening there, while the French and English were in Tahiti, Tasmania was also visited by early French expeditions like Bruni d'Entrecasteaux in 1792 and 93, trying to find La Perouse, who disappeared 1788. But it wasn't just about provisioning, which is a big part of the story of Tahiti. It was also about science too. So do you want to talk a bit about what you've learned about the French and their ecological exchanges in Tasmania?
Well, certainly when the French voyage came to look for La Perouse, it was a voyage of scientists. You know, they had a lot of botanists, they had zoologists, they had astronomers, and actually they were looking to chart the transit of Venus. And so they set up at Recherche Bay for that purpose. Then botanist Labillardière went and described a whole lot of plants, collected samples, of course, described those plants, including the Eucalyptus globulus, Diploretum aurea, and while he was doing the formal botany, if you like, his gardener, Felix de la Haye, was planting, not only distributing seeds everywhere, much the same as Tim was saying about Bligh, but he actually established a kitchen garden, 9 metres by 7 metres, which is quite extraordinary, and planted things like cabbages and potatoes and radishes and whatever. And that obviously had the intent that when they came back the following year or other explorers came, that there would be foodstuffs for them. So provisioning was part of it. But also they had observed that the Aboriginal women would dive every day for abalone and other seafood. And part of what's written in the diaries was that if these food crops flourished, it might make life a bit easier for, in their view, for Aboriginal women. So there was also a real interest in Aboriginal culture, and the French engagement with Tasmanian Aboriginal people is really quite wonderful compared with what happened when the British came. The French, being scientists, they wanted to actually observe and try to engage with Aboriginal people, and they wrote down a lot of Aboriginal words. And interestingly, of course, the Tasmanian Aboriginal languages were lost over time, but the Tasmanian Aboriginal community is now restructuring a language, Palawakani, and they have used some of the words that the French had written down as the basis of helping to restructure language. So that is actually an interesting level of exchange over a couple of centuries. The garden, of course, didn't prosper, and nothing became invasive because of it at this end. At the other end, a lot of the plants and seeds that were collected were taken, were first of all stolen by the English, because the Revolutionary War, the ships were taken in Batavia. The British took the seeds back, took the collection back to England. And then later, after the Revolutionary War, Joseph Banks, who was a friend of Labiardier, intervened and had all of the samples returned to France. And many of them were planted out at Malmaison, which was Empress Josephine's garden. And there were even Tasmanian emus and black swans there. So there was quite an interesting exchange.
Yeah, lots of exchange there with the French. Jenny, we'll come back to you because I mean, there's so much in your book, Trading Nature, that really, where do you start? And do you want to talk a little bit about those early exchanges and maybe what were some of the most impacting species that were exchanged, both by what was brought by the Europeans and maybe what the Tahitians was brought back from Tahiti by the Europeans, because there was lots of moving around once these interactions began with the Europeans.
Yes, thanks. I guess, yeah, there were so many species passing back and forth. I think one of the really influential ones that brought a lot of Europeans to Tahiti, which then had a big impact on the island, was pigs. And so pigs were actually, they were part of the very first interaction between Europeans and Tahitians, because as Wallace anchored off just off the coast of Tahiti, they were coming there to, as you were mentioning at the beginning, to get food. They were starving and they were all struck down with scurvy. They really needed food quickly. As they came near the shore, they were surrounded by about 100 canoes, and quite a few people came on board. And the sailors they wanted to communicate what they wanted. So the first actual communication, functional communication between the two sides, was sailors grunting like pigs and also making the sounds of chickens. And the Tahitians got it. They made those sounds back. They made the sounds of pigs back and chickens back, and they pointed to the shore and said, made sort of gestures to say they would bring them, and they did. And so that's how that relationship first started. The first communication was actually using the grunts of pigs. I think it was quite wonderful. And so from then on, pigs were involved in pretty much every trade, every back and forth between those two sides. And pigs were a very important part, sacred part, and functional part of Tahitian management of life and relationships with the beings in the Po, or the realm of the dead. And so they were very important conduits for communication and passing of spiritual essences within Tahiti. So actually turning them into a trade commodity had all sorts of implications. I could talk a bit more about pigs in more detail later, perhaps. But one of the things that, because I'll just quickly mention, because they were also traded to Australia for 25 years, and so they were an important part of what was happening out in the colony. But just to also flag that you'd imagine that when missionaries brought in rabbits into Tahiti in 1800, you said, your heart sinks when you read something like that, because you think, oh no, there's the moment where rabbits take over and destroy the island. The islands are so vulnerable. Of course, you'd imagine that they'd have a really big impact there, as they did on other islands. But every place and every set of people had their own particular set of circumstances and their own strengths and ways of impacting on any species that's introduced. And Tahiti wasn't just completely open to all species that came, and it was very dependent on what they wanted to have established there. That's what was really governing a lot of what was going on. And so cats had a big impact because, as Wallace gave Perea, the local chiefess at the time, a cat who was pregnant, and Cook brought in about 20 cats on one of his voyages. Yeah, he said he felt that it was going to be helpful and useful, and they were always giving them to the local high caste women. So the women who were part of the chiefly families there were given quite a few gifts, and that often included cats, and they were only ever given to women. I think women and cats had always had an association in the European mind as things that went together. They were witches' familiars, or they're also often sort of associated with sexual license. And so it's kind of like, it was probably a hidden joke that the sailors found entertaining, that they were giving cats to women in Tahiti. But actually for women, those chiefly women, those cats were an important status symbol. They showed that they were able to manage these newcomers, these visitors really well, sufficiently to get the kinds of gifts that they wanted. And Perea had her favourite cat, who was descended from Cook's gift. And because she was protecting these cats and looking after them and so on, they're part of her chiefly possessions. They actually did really well on the island, and they they reproduced really well, and as they do everywhere, ate a lot of the birds, local bird species. And so some of the ground-dwelling birds, almost all of them, became very quickly extinct. So the rails, some of which had very specific spiritual roles. One of them, for instance, was the material form of a particular god, and people, the Tahitians would be listening out for that particular rail for quite a while to be able to, anytime they wanted to hear from that particular god, they'd be listening out for messages from that bird. They went extinct very quickly, and some other species were only ever documented once or twice before going extinct.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great examples, and I think what I really took away from reading your book was that the interactions and the species that were either brought onto the island or were removed was largely a negotiation, and it wasn't certainly something that one side or the other had total control. But I might just, before I come back to you, Jenny, I just want to remind everybody that this is a Q&A, so we'd love to hear your questions. There's been no questions yet. Just if this is generating some curiosity or there's more questions, please throw them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, but the Q&A. And I might just come to Tim for a second, because Tim, you've been looking at some of the species that have been moved from Australia to Tahiti. Do you want to talk about a bit of that, about what you found out?
Yeah, well, there was this Eastern Guild who was a wealthy American who moved to Tahiti, and he wanted to just brighten up the place with bird life. And if we can believe what he wrote in a couple of articles, he imported 7,000 birds of 35 species that he liberated on the island with trays of seed to help them establish. And Taronga Zoo was helping him. And so he was sent like Gouldian finches, starfinches, black swans, other Australian finches, tanagers from South America, North American siskins, mockingbirds. This extraordinary mix of birds. So it's exactly the kind of bad introduction that we don't approve of today. Most of the birds just died. There are only two that established, but silver eyes and a tanager.
So this occurred, long after the period of the European explorers. So sounds like Tahiti's been subjected to lots of introductions that have had a big impact.
Yes, it was a much later period of time. I can't remember offhand the year, 1930s, I think it was.
Thanks, Tim. I might come to Richard now. Richard, our Indigenous ambassador. I mean, Richard, what does this all mean for the Indigenous people in Australia, given, I'm just trying to think about the parallels between the movement of plants and animals in Tahiti with the movement of plants and animals in Australia and that early colonial period. I mean, Cook was the second British captain to arrive in Tahiti, but he had a massive impact on Australians, the Indigenous nations, people, and our ecosystems. So what does this conversation really mean for you, Richard?
I think Cook was a man of his time, but I think Australia, what it means here is Australians think, oh, we didn't know better back then, and in many circumstances we certainly did. And I studied Cook a bit because blackfellas hate Cook, and I just think he's a man of his time. And there are other people involved in the colony who were a lot worse than Cook. But when he was the third boat to land at Tahiti, and he had his men checked for venereal disease because he had a full understanding of germ warfare, etc. And within 2 weeks, one of his men presented with venereal disease. I think his terminology was the pox. And he said that this is like closing the coffin door upon paradise, for these people are now doomed for our intrusions and from our intrusions. And the understanding that we did have scientifically and back then were vast. I mean, it wasn't, none of this was new knowledge, and particularly invasive species. They knew from the Roman Empire what certain species did to certain landscapes. So I think it's cultural, and this sort of knowledge needs to be out. And I applaud people like Jenny for writing this kind of book, because it matters that we do start to understand who we are and what we came from and what we did know back then.
Yeah, I just need to keep moving on, but that's great observations, and it's really good to see some questions coming in now. So thanks for those. I might just come to different people as we proceed to answer those questions. So Jenny, I might just come back to you because we touched on this a bit, but and Christine talked about some of the scientific motivations of some of the interactions, the ecological exchanges. What was the primary motivation for the Europeans, do you think, in those early stages? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I think there was the primary motivation was to make sure they could have really good provisioning stations across the Pacific as the colonial project started to unroll. And initially it was really sort of exploration. They wanted to be able to explore and see what resources were out there that they could bring back to Britain and to France and Spain. And they also wanted to be looking for potential territories to expand into. And so to do that, you couldn't take all that you needed to feed your crew. There's usually about like 100 to 130 people on board for a year or two. And so of course you had to be able to provision as you were traveling. And they wanted to be able to have reliable food, food that was a bit familiar, food that they knew the sailors would want to eat, which is why they kept bringing out lots of livestock. Even though it was incredibly difficult to take, all these huge animals on board, quite small ships really, and to have, plants they could recognise from home. But at the same time, there was another really important imperative as well, and that was all about really helping to improve places that they went to. So there was I think European culture was always very caught up in hierarchies. Everything was put into hierarchies. And so you had hierarchies of society within society, and those at the top had an obligation to help those who were less fortunate. So help them to learn what they needed to learn and to be good, moral, upright people and so on. So there was all that sort of sense of, paternalism and making sure that you were looking after those who had fewer privileges. And then there were hierarchies in terms of nations, and to be able to show what a great nation you were, you'd be able to do all sorts of great things as you went out around the world, and you could discover all these new places and new things and bring back evidence of that. And you could also help those places and societies who were deemed to be, sort of over time, they were deemed to be of sort of lesser on the scale of civilization, or they'd had fewer opportunities given them to develop to the state where they had reached themselves. And so there was this sense that it was a great project of improvement and beneficence. So it was really being very generous with all their advantages. So all the wonderful animals and plants they had in Europe would be appreciated by all the Indigenous people they met. So
sometimes it didn't quite work that way, did it? They
no, not work that way.
appreciate the efforts of the British.
That's right. So yes, they did feel that it was they were often quite frustrated that the Tahitians didn't appreciate the gifts that they were giving them. They often would just let animals just go. They weren't that interested in them. Sometimes, like the Bligh and the others, or Banks and others as well, were planting things that took a lot of effort, and they looked after them while they were there on shore. And there were things like, oranges and grapefruits and grapes and all sorts of things. And then the Tahitians would try them once they'd fruited, and they'd try like a grapefruit or a grape maybe before it was ripe, and they were horribly bitter, and they just trampled on them or just pulled them up and saying, well, these things are horrible. They did like oranges, and they did like pineapples and mangoes and things like that. So those were cultivated by the Tahitians, but all the ship's captains and a lot of the officers, and certainly the missionaries, were frequently just driven to distraction because they'd done so much to bring these incredible gifts out, these wonderful things that would have helped them so much. And they were just, not at all valued. The Tahitians assumed that people kept coming because of their sweet food. And so they knew they already had all the sweet food that the Europeans wanted. And they would things like break up breeding pairs. So your cook would be very careful to explain. He'd give a chief a breeding pair of cattle and say, make sure you keep them together, look after them in this way. And the chiefs would be like, yeah, whatever. They don't want to drink the milk from the cows. It was kind of disgusting. And they didn't want to eat the meat. They had their own pigs. They saw them as useful diplomatic gifts to give to another chief to try and cement alliances, but that meant that breeding pairs were being split up. So all those efforts kept being undermined.
Jenny, there's a question that's come in about black rats. Now, we had the Polynesian rat on the island that actually the Polynesian brought to Tahiti.
That's right.
1,500 years ago when they first colonized. But what impact did the black rats have on the environment? And this question actually asks for both the environmental and human impacts.
Yeah, really good question. So the Polynesian rats were an integral part of Polynesian society, and so they were usually quite tame and would just be around. They're quite small, and they would eat vegetables, fruits, and seeds. That was it. And then also little scraps from dinner table around the households. So that's Rattus exulans, the Polynesian rat. So Rattus rattus, the black rat that came in on the European ships, was a different kettle of fish. To mix the metaphors there, it's bigger, it's really omnivorous. It eats small animals, small birds, eggs, and so it was really destructive of the Tahitian environment and the other Pacific islands that it ended up in. Of course, they just ran ashore off the ships, and they therefore contributed to the extinction of many bird species and they also would eat other, I think, small reptiles and so on. And so they were really destructive. And whenever you're losing a species from a really intricately interconnected society, you're losing really important cultural, spiritual, living components. And so it had huge knock-on effects. Every time a species was lost, particularly if it was an ata of the material representation of a god, it undermined the strength of that god or or those particular spiritual relationships that had been there. And so for a lot of Tahitians at the time, everything started to feel like it was coming unstuck, and that the gods no longer had the power they used to have. If it was possible for their material manifestation, their ata, to actually be killed and disappear, that god obviously had lost all its power. People started to get all these diseases, and huge numbers of people were dying from the diseases brought in by the Europeans. And so, it just unsettled the whole structure of relationships between the living and the dead, and between all the structures within Tahitian society. So the rats contributed to that. and as missionaries were presenting this new god, a Christian god, that suddenly seemed like quite an appealing to be aligned with.
Sorry, Jenny, I can see why it's such a huge disruption in so many ways, all of this, that big rapid change. It might be a good time to bring Richard in, because this idea of ecological exchange, and maybe for Richard, I'm really interested, Richard, to sort of understand the role of ecological exchange in Aboriginal culture, and maybe just you might want to touch on commenting on what you just heard from Jenny about the impacts of the European disruption to that.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, Jenny said it well. We have totems, and so, your totems started going extinct. Desert people would never put their hand in even a water hole. They would drink only with their mouth, and then you'd have stock all through the water holes. I guess there were changes in history, but they must have happened in such a long time, and how rapid the changes were. And then I don't know how it really played out for the Tahitian people, but Aboriginal people, it was invasion by sheep, and then so you were losing your landscape, your family, the elders were being shot out. The English were very good at what they did, and so, I mean, if you just take the Aboriginal flag, for example, I mean, it's been around since the 70s, but the earth part and the people part are equal in that flag, and that's what that represents. The land we lived upon, and ourselves, he was given equal weight to society, and so, you start tearing the country apart. You're tearing the people apart, and that's. I assume it was the same everywhere, and it's been.
Sorry, Richard. Do you think the First Nations people actually had any ability to stop some of these introductions? Obviously, it was pretty brutal and very one-sided, but were there some examples where maybe the Aboriginal people managed to stop some of the invasions that were occurring, the ecological invasions?
I'm not too sure. I haven't heard of any. I know that people used to, even in Mitchell's accounts, there were people who were trying to fence out their waterways just to keep the stock out of their water holes, and the things got where stock went, everything else followed, and I guess any time someone, particularly with stock, if people tried to get stock to move on, then they were brutally treated. I do know stories through people that often burnt country that would have never been burnt before. It wasn't time to burn it, and it wasn't culturally appropriate to burn it. They burn it in the hope that there'd be no fodder for the sheep herds, and the people with the sheep would have to move on and go to different country.
Yes, yeah, it's pretty brutal period, like I said. Jenny, I might come back to you because there's a few questions coming in. One question asked about pigs and sort of when they arrived, and also there's a question from Jeff Lees, which talked about some of those early arrivals from the Polynesian. When the Polynesians arrived, they brought with them, well, you mentioned the Polynesian rat, but they already had chooks and dogs. And they also traded with the South Americans. They had some sweet potato, for example. Can you talk a bit about those ecological exchanges, if you like, and some of the benefits or the impacts of that?
Yes. So, of course, those were the really early phases of ecological exchanges between islanders and other islanders, and people around the world in that early voyaging, colonization of the Pacific by Pacific Islanders coming over from the West. They were bringing, as you've mentioned, all those species, but also pigs, and they were bringing breadfruit and other tubers. Breadfruit and tubers, and they were able to bring them in ways that ensured that they'd be able to be established in any new islands they made landfall on. There was also a lot of trading between islands. So when, for instance, people living on a coral atoll wouldn't necessarily have enough to grow a lot of their own food on shore, they could get lots of fish and so on, but they would often trade with the volcanic islands, the high islands, for soil and also for seeds and tubers. So that was another trade. And in return, they'd be giving pearls and pearl shell. And also Tahiti traded with Tuamotus for the white fur of the particular dogs that they had in the Tuamotus, these white dogs, because they like to use that for fringing on the tuami, which are the like warriors' gorgets that were worn, very dramatic looking things. And this white fur was very particular to the Tuamotus. So there's lots of these sort of trades between the islands. But certainly,
what I thought in your book, you talked a lot about how those exchanges were developed. They developed sort of customs and traditions in their culture that really regulated their use of those species. Do you want to speak to that?
Yes, that's right. So there was lots of ways that the amounts that were traded in between places were managed, and chiefs were responsible for making sure there was always enough food for their own people before they traded away. Initially, at least, things got a bit out of hand when there was really powerful new trading elements coming in, like muskets and ammunition and so on. So those sorts of levels of care of the local manahune, the common people, slightly went out the window. But earlier, when chiefs were being really careful to look after their people, they made sure that they had rahui, or times of restriction, placed on particular species. And so there'd be a rahui on a particular fish, for instance, at a certain time of year when that fish was breeding, and so you weren't able to fish that particular fish then. And so that would make sure that the stocks would build up, and then local people could fish them as they needed at the right time when the rahui was lifted, but also it was then, those were then available for trading to others. And so that was the case for all species, on shore as well as in the ocean, but everything was managed very carefully.
You touched on the pigs earlier and the trade in pig meat. That it was surprising to learn that Tahitians were actually a really important source of meat for the early colony in Sydney. But what in the book I thought was really interesting was the way, obviously there's a lot of pigs that are needed to supply that meat, and that had all sorts of flow-on effects about the way the Europeans worked with one chief, but that they would then be able to source supplies from other chiefs. Do you want to speak a bit about how that trade worked internally on Tahiti?
Yes, so from 1801, the colony in New South Wales was finding they really just weren't making it work with farming, and they weren't making it work with supporting themselves with meat at all. They really needed to be relying on the imported meat from like salt pork and salt beef from like England and a few other places, but it was really expensive to do that. And it occurred to Governor King that actually there were so many ships coming back and forth between the Pacific, particularly stopping off in Tahiti, that it'd be good to set up a relationship with one of the main chiefs who was just by Matavai Bay. And he sent a whole bunch of gifts over and said, what do you reckon? Would you like to supply pigs to the colony, because we really need them? George Vancouver had come through and had just a few years earlier had brought about 100 live pigs to the colony, but that hadn't quite worked out. For some reason, they didn't manage to keep the pigs alive enough to keep breeding from them in New South Wales for some reason. I don't know what went wrong. So they weren't very good at managing things there. But when Governor King sent this gift over to Tu, he included with that lots of guns and ammunition, and Tu could see this as his chance actually to try and increase his stock of weaponry that the other potential sources of weapons hadn't come up with. So earlier voyagers had been quite careful to not bring too much in terms of guns into the islands, and the missionaries had certainly been putting the brakes on any of that. So this new trade suddenly was offering Tu the chance to really build himself up in comparison to the other chiefs on the island. And through the trade with New South Wales, where they were salting up, they'd give away about, for the pork, from about 1,600 or so pigs per shipload, and there'd be about 6 or 7 ships per year. It was a lot of pigs.
Yes.
And pigs were this hugely important part of Tahitian society. They were needed not just for food, but also for, like, anytime someone was getting married, they'd need to be giving a pig to the family that they were marrying into. You'd also need to present pigs to the gods as a sacrifice. They were one of the most common ones. You could also use dolphins and turtles and other animals, but it was pigs particularly that were the key thing, were keeping the gods happy. And so to suddenly shift them from being this really important sacred animal and utilitarian animal in the right circumstances into being a commodity to trade for guns was really a huge shift, and caused this big concentration of power just around Matavai Bay, which had big implications politically and socially, culturally, and economically for Tahiti from then on.
Yes, good. Thanks, Jenny. I mean, we're talking to Jenny today about Trading Nature, her book. It's hard to get, I think, but you can still buy it online. It's by Hawaii Press.
Yes.
Trading Nature, Tahitians, Europeans, and Ecological Exchange. Now, there's been some good questions. I think we've answered quite a few of them. We're starting to run out of time, which is a real pity. I might come to Christine next, because Christine, you're an avid gardener, and gardening is it's really about ecological exchange, isn't it? What thinking do gardeners bring to the way plants, animals, and birds are moved and traded, Christine?
I would think, well, the first thing, if we go back to colonial times, and particularly in the context of Jenny's book, it's part of that idea of civilizing the environment that people are moving to. This idea that where they're going is inferior to where they've left, and therefore they have to bring the plants and animals that'll make them feel at home, as well as provision them and set up agriculture and so on. So it was that sense of the Australian environment really was quite inferior to the European one, and hence we had to bring a lot of plants and animals for a garden, and gardens were also a status symbol. So if you had a substantial land grant and a big house, you had to have the big garden, it had to have roses and so on, as indeed the penal settlement of Port Arthur had a significant rose garden, because we needed to show that the commandant's garden was suitable for his level of status and so on. So you had that. And of course, we're still fighting it in Australia. So we still have people who want exotic plants and animals because it gives them status, it gives them something nobody else has, which is why we have such a substantial illegal trade in wildlife, for example. And people are always trying to bring things in illegally. So, for example, the bumblebee in Tasmania brought here because gardeners, in this case commercial gardeners, wanted it to pollinate their hothouses for tomatoes. And of course, there are people on the mainland who desperately want those bumblebees brought to the mainland for the same reason. So those sort of drivers. But in Tasmania, they brought gorse, which has been and remains an enormous scourge that was brought in the early days. The same with blackbirds and, of course, feral deer. Deer were brought here into the Midlands, again, to those big land holdings because it made people feel at home. They just had to have the birds and the plants and everything that surrounded them. And of course, it got away, and we continue to fight that. But it's not just a colonial mentality. It has taken 200 years for people to think of a native garden as being absolutely marvellous and something to be proud of and enjoyed. People are always trying to bring in exotics as well. So there is that issue. And of course, nurseries play into that too by ordering in the exotic plants, which people then plant out, and they become invasive. Over the fence they go into the bushland, the paddock next door, and away they go as an invasive into our environment. So this trade in plants in particular, cultural, historical, but contemporary as well. And that's why the Invasive Species Council is so important, to just bring to people's awareness that this exchange might feel good, but it's actually terrible ecologically.
Yes, thanks, Christine. I might bring the other panelists in all together now, because I think we're sort of nearing the end, and any of the questions we didn't get to, we might answer on our website when we put up the recording. Tim, I might come to you because there was one question about the number of species that have become extinct in Tahiti. We've talked about the extinctions from the cats and the rodents. I'm not sure if you know that, but I think just thinking about what you've heard, Tim, there's a fact that I've got, which is there currently are 825 native plants in Tahiti, but there are 1,700 introduced plants. So obviously, as trade has increased, even past this European exploration era, there's lots of movement and lots of impacts. Do you want to talk about that, Tim?
Yeah, look, if we are to talk about extinctions, there were the first wave of extinctions by the Polynesians themselves, killing flightless rails. So the introduction of Pacific rats could have played a role in some of those extinctions as well. But yeah, I mean, I think the Miconia tree in Tahiti, that it is leaves as big as tea towels, is enormous
I'll just
leaves.
share that. I've got a picture of that, Tim. I'll just share that on the screen.
Yeah, I hope you can. Yeah. Well, I said it's big as a tea towel. It's quite a bit bigger than your average tea towel. And so that's, shading out a lot of the native Tahitian trees, which are, by some estimates, likely to go extinct just from the huge germination of these. And I mean, the interesting thing is that the Eastern Guild, when he imports silver eyes, they are now spreading the seeds by eating the fruit of this plant. So this sort of interconnected. I mean, Gill didn't import this plant; it was someone else who did. But there's this interconnected sort of invasive impact. So I think we've got to accept that you have to import plants. I mean, it wouldn't make sense not to have wheat and potatoes and tomatoes in Australia, but we're always excessive, as Christine is saying. I've got to have that rare plant, and we have to know when to slow this process down, and what starts off as good importations can soon become bad importations. And I think it's really important to address that issue.
Richard, what does ecological exchange, trading nature, just given what we've just talked about, what are your thoughts about it?
In 2024, we've got to start on the journey of healing country, and we need the best of regenerative science. We need the people like we're listening to today, and some plants, like Tim says, they're here and they're here to stay. But and like Christine was saying, you know, there's some plants we really need to work, or invasive species, not just plants, but we really need to work at keeping them out and fixing the most disastrous of these mistakes. And we're going to have to tread very cautiously moving forward, which that's exactly what we do as the ISC. I'm really proud to be a part of that.
Thank you, Richard. All right, maybe Jenny, I'll maybe hand it over to you to sort of a wrap up, because you know, we've been talking a bit, and particularly things have changed so much for Tahitians, and you know, they entered a new period when they were taken over by the French, so that was no longer cultural negotiations. It was totally a different way of moving plants and animals. Maybe my question for you, Jenny, is really, what are the big lessons here from what you've learned in writing your book?
Yes, there's many big lessons, and many lessons also from what Richard's just been saying. I think always the importance of listening to Indigenous people and learning from that wisdom, and doing what we can to step up as stewards of the places we live in, that we rely on, that are our life support systems, that we're an intimate part of. Always, yeah, learning if we're part of a colonial community, then we need to make sure we stop the damage of that colonialism, and that we, as Richard said, heal country and bring in as many native species into our gardens as we can. Listen to how it is that we can best support and step up as stewards for the incredible diversity of species in Australia, and of course in other parts of the world. But our job here is to, as rapidly as possible, make sure that we're supporting all the incredible richness of life here, and just recognize what can happen once we do that, and control the invasive species, and also recognize we can never predict what will happen when you bring in a new species into a new place. And if all those histories of introduced species shows that no matter how well you think you've studied it, no matter how well you think we've got this under control, we don't have it under control. That we just can't, as people playing God and bringing in new species, thinking that we know what's going to happen. You just don't actually know what's going to roll out from that. We need to, I was just going to say, we need to increase our ecological intelligence. We need to understand all that surround us, and understand the impacts we have on it, and our responsibilities to take care of it.
That's a great way to finish, Jenny. Ecological intelligence. I think we need a bit of that all round, don't we? I want to thank today the special guest, Jenny Newell from the Australian Museum's Climate Solutions Centre, who wrote the book Trading Nature. Thank you, Jenny. It's been fascinating.
It's been wonderful. Thank you. Really great conversation. Thanks.
And the panelists, Christine Milne, our ambassador from Tasmania, Tim Lowe in Queensland, thank you, co-founder, and Richard Swain, our Indigenous ambassador. Thank you, Richard, from New South Wales. So that's it for our 10th Aliens Among Us webinar. Thanks all for the questions. There were some really good questions, and those that we didn't get to, we can put up responses on the website. We'll put the recording on the website as well. The next Aliens Among Us will be in the next 2 or 3 months. We're just lining up our next speaker. Thanks for joining us. It was really great to learn about Jenny's book, and great to learn different aspects, really unexpected aspects about invasive species. Have a great day. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.